In a stark new commentary titled, "The Minnesota War Zone is Trump's Most Trumpian Accomplishment," The New Yorker argues that President Donald Trump's actions toward Minnesota have become a defining and deeply controversial element of his second term, revealing the aggressive and punitive style of governance critics say now characterizes his leadership. The article, written amid heightened national tensions and published on January 16, 2026, paints a picture of a state transformed into a battleground between federal authorities and local communities in and around Minneapolis and St. Paul. What once were protests and civil rights demonstrations, particularly around immigration enforcement and policing, have escalated into what the writer calls a militarized confrontation between the federal government and Minnesota residents. From protests to federal crackdown. According to the piece, Trump's administration invoked the Insurrection Act and deployed thousands of federal agents to Minnesota, a move that critics argue went far beyond conventional law enforcement. What began as responses to unrest tied to immigration policies evolved into sweeping operations that saw indiscriminate stops, raids, and aggressive tactics that civil liberties groups say violated constitutional rights. Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz is quoted as condemning the campaign, denouncing it as organized brutality, and decrying the widespread use of force against everyday residents. Local officials and civil rights advocates maintain that routine public safety measures were overshadowed by excessive federal intervention, leaving ordinary communities caught in the crosshairs of an expansive crackdown. The commentary positions Minnesota not as an isolated case, but as a symbol of Trump's approach to power and retribution. The writer suggests that the escalation in Minnesota reflects a broader trend in which Trump targets states and communities perceived as resistant to his policies, particularly those aligned with Democratic leadership, with heavy federal responses. Critics in the piece argue that this undermines constitutional norms and the traditional balance between federal authority and state governance. Rather than restraining the situation, the article argues, Trump's rhetoric and actions have intensified it, transforming protests over civil rights and immigration into a titular war zone, where the government's focus appears to be less on consensus and more on dominance. The analysis frames this evolution as emblematic of what the author calls Trump's most quintessentially Trumpian accomplishment, a stark exercise of raw executive power that blurs the lines between law enforcement, military intervention, and political retaliation. Despite the dramatic scope of the federal intervention, the piece notes that courts have not yet curbed the actions, leaving civil liberties advocates deeply concerned about the implications for constitutional freedoms. The situation, as described, raises questions about the limits of executive authority, especially when deployed against American citizens and local governments rather than in foreign conflicts or clearly defined insurrections. The New Yorker commentary concludes that what is occurring in Minnesota is not an aberration but the logical extension of Trump's political instincts, a relentless drive toward asserting federal strength in states and regions that challenge his agenda. In this telling, the Minnesota confrontation becomes less about specific policies and more about the use of state power as a weapon, a legacy that, according to the article, may define Trump's presidency as much as any domestic or foreign policy initiative.